Welcome to the Equity Matters series run by eAlliance, a Canadian Gender Equity and Sport Research Hub. My name is Gretchen Kerr, and I have the privilege and pleasure of being one of the co-directors of eAlliance, along with my colleagues, Professor Guylaine Demers of Laval University and Professor Anne Pegueraro from Guelph University. We're delighted to have you here today to join us in this important discussion. I would also like to, of course, welcome our special guest, our featured guest today, Stephanie Dixon, whom I know is well known to many here in the audience. Stephanie has played many critical roles within the Canadian sport landscape over the years, including beginning an Olympic swimming career at the age of 16, participating in 3 Olympic Games, and is one of the most decorated Canadian Olympians, having won 19 medals across the Games. She then went on to broadcast the Paralympic Games after that and move into coaching. And in addition, she was inducted into Canada's Sport Hall of Fame and appointed to the Order of Canada. Most recently, Stephanie served as the chef for the 2020 Paralympic Games that were held this past summer. Across all of her endeavors, she has been a fierce advocate for inclusive sport and is a well-respected leader in the field. We're just delighted to have her here with us today. In terms of format, Stephanie and I are going to have a conversation, and then we will turn it over to Q&A. So I would invite participants to drop their questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to get as many as possible. And we will finish at 12:45 today. So let's get started. There's so much we can learn from you, Stephanie, but perhaps we could start with your experiences as an athlete, your experiences with equity, and what led you to stay involved in sport once you finished your athletic career?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I'm just really honored to be here with all of you today to discuss equity in sport in Canada. And so for those of you who don't know me, a little bit of my background is I was born with one leg. And my parents wanted to put me in all sorts of different sports at a very young age so that I didn't feel that having one leg needed to hold me back. And they knew that that would be the attitude from society. So I was very fortunate to be born into a family that really had that thoughtfulness about what life might be like for somebody with one leg. And they wanted to give me as many tools and armor as possible as I faced prejudice and just misconceptions and bias in society that is still very strong. So I began swimming when I was 2 and turned into a little fish. I've always loved being in the water more than anywhere else in the world. In my happy place, my safe place is in the water. And I tried every other sport you could possibly imagine, even softball, and softball with one leg is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. But again, very fortunate to have parents who didn't just want to put me in sports where I would excel. They saw the benefit of putting me in unique and challenging situations so that I would have to learn to use my body and not necessarily be the best at everything. So I began sport with a very positive and healthy perspective, but I didn't know about disability, and I didn't know about equity or parasport. And I think that this was with really good intentions of my parents, but we just didn't talk about disability. And I think they thought that that would be helpful to me. But at the end of the day, I do have a disability and I do have to navigate it in society. And I think that that's just more the tone that it was in the 80s. People didn't talk about it. When I passed kids with their parents and the kids say, oh, look, she has one leg, the reaction would be like, oh, like, don't talk about it, and like quickly usher their kids away. So I grew up in a time where we wanted to pretend disability wasn't happening at all. So going through the Canadian sports system, I truly believed that it was my job to figure out how I fit into an inaccessible and not very inclusive sports system. And it was not like I didn't have rights. It didn't even occur to me to think what was owed to me as an athlete. It was always just my job to figure out how to fit in as best as possible. And it was very confusing because as I competed and trained against athletes without disability and could hold my own. I did quite well in swimming. But then I also found parasport. And it was really, really difficult for me to feel proud of being a woman with a disability, to want to be a para athlete, to try and represent my country, to be a Paralympian, because I was conditioned the way everyone else is, and kind of had this view that disability meant you were less than. And so I did everything I could to just fit into mainstream sport, and not wanting to have what felt like a label on my head. So I give a lot of credit to my coach and my parents who encouraged me to participate in parasport. They said, you can do both. You can still participate against, athletes who don't have disability, but I think it's really important for you to also get to know other athletes with a disability. So at that point, they recognized how important it would be for me to find a place where I truly felt I belonged and see other people who I could identify with. And so I did go through my athletic career in both mainstream sport against athletes without disability. And then I did decide to pursue parasport. And as Gretchen said, competed in 3 Paralympic Games. Throughout my entire career, I really struggled with what it meant to be a Paralympian versus an Olympian. And I noticed in the introduction, the word Olympian was used, and it's such mixed feelings. You want to feel proud of being a Paralympian, but when people don't know what the Paralympics are, or they still feel it's a participation event, or just have that attitude of like, good for you for participating, it's really hard to stand tall and feel proud of your accomplishments. So it's my experience as an athlete led me to have, my experience in sport as well as life as a woman with a disability has led to some internal trauma, just about, how do I be proud of myself in a world that has such low expectations for me? And so in sport, I think I used it as a platform to prove my worth. And I think it led to a lot of success, but also a lot of harm at the same time.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Stephanie. And it really kind of sets the context for the rest of our conversation, which is, and we'll get to, lessons learned from the recent games a little bit later. But before we do, given that context, what have you seen in the way of changes, advancements, since those early days and those early experiences? Has much changed in Canada? If so, what is it? Just a sense of where we've come since your early days of introduction to parasports.
I think we're at a very interesting time where through my life, I've noticed a lot of change in the way that I'm perceived. Going back to the example of parents shushing their kids if they notice I have a disability, I would say more times than not now parents might say, well, maybe you can go up and ask her. And I will have kids come up or parents be like, is it okay if we ask you a question? And that's so great. And so kids are more being encouraged to be curious about diversity and difference. And so that's really exciting to see. I think when I came home from Sydney in 2000, 90% of people in Canada did not know what the Paralympics were. And it was really hard for me to want to talk about my experience when it was more of an educational conversation rather than celebrating what I had accomplished. And today I feel I don't know if it's 90%, but most Canadians do know what the Paralympic Games are. The idea that it's a participation event is starting to change, and people recognizing that it is a high performance, it is world-class sport. The athletes happen to have a disability and be put into different classifications, just as we do in many sports with weight categories or gender categories. There is a lot more link with the Olympic team and the Paralympic team. It was great to see on social media a lot of Olympians were wishing the Paralympians good luck, and vice versa. And there's a lot of events where we do come together. Most of the our sponsors on television will have ads that are about Olympians and Paralympians together. So I think that that's really helping to give, or just to make sure that people understand that this is high performance, and it is not a nice thing that for people to participate. It is really intense, elite, high performance sport. We are being covered more in the news. So for the first time in Tokyo, we had prime time coverage, and it brought me to tears when I found out this news, because growing up, I never saw anyone who I could identify with on television unless they were being portrayed in the tone of a victim or somebody we felt sorry for. So knowing that young kids with disabilities and young kids without disabilities would see on television, it was so accessible to them right there. And I mean, especially online as well, social media increases that platform. But to see people with disabilities, all different types of bodies, who are physically excelling, who are being put in the position of being a role model and a leader, also brought me to tears. I had lots of teary moments at these Paralympics, knowing that young kids with disabilities were having role models to look up to. And that was really, really exciting. Mm-hmm. Those are the positive things. Even though we are being covered more in the media, there is still a big struggle for the media to cover the Paralympics or Paralympians in a respectful way. So before going to the Games, I was speaking to a journalist who was really struggling to describe our bodies, and the word deformed came out. And I know that they probably regretted it as soon as it happened, but that's traumatizing to be called deformed or disfigured, and I think it's just a lack of education and awareness. But the media is powerful, and so I think that education piece has to be there. It's absolutely crucial. When I was in Japan, I had a journalist ask me what my thoughts were about the idea that some people had that people with disabilities should be eliminated from the planet. And this is probably one of the most horrifying things that's ever happened to me, especially in the sport context, because I knew we were fighting for equity and inclusion as people with disability, but to go to a place of genocide was really horrifying. And so, but it was a good eye opener that those views do exist, and that we are still fighting a very, very uphill battle as people with disability to be looked at as equal members of society who deserve to have equal access and inclusion in society and in sport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's so important, because we have one context here in Canada, but when you go to the Games in an international event, you see how Canada can be compared with other countries, and where other countries are in terms of inclusion and equity. Are there other, sort of lessons learned from your role in the recent Games?
Yeah, so many lessons. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting. I mean, it was an incredible honor to be chef de mission for these Games. It felt like my career had come full circle, where sport changed my life, possibly saved my life. It gave me a place to really learn about my body, feel proud of my body, feel empowered and beautiful in a very atypical body. And to have people who supported me. I was so fortunate to have people who really did believe in me. When society thought what my potential was down here, I had coaches and support systems and teammates who saw my potential up here. And that really is what has allowed me to become a strong and confident individual and leader in sport. I was forgetting where that train of thought was going. Oh yes, full circle. And so then now to be in a position where I can be an advocate and be a support for the current generation of athletes was just such an incredible honor to have that role. But I think something that's very clear to me from being in this position is how much sport and the Paralympic sport movement is being run by people without disability and without the lens of what it is like for people with disability. And my thought is that this stems from maybe 10 years ago, the sports system feeling like you heard a lot with para athletes wanting to be described as, I'm an athlete. And I've said this myself, I'm an athlete first and foremost, disability aside, I'm an athlete first. And I think that that's created a system where, okay, let's create a sports system, athletes, period. But at the end of the day, is that para-athletes, athletes with disabilities, there are specific resources and tools and language and a lens. Like when you're serving an oppressed group of people with disability are still quite severely oppressed around the world and in Canada as well. And I think that there's an aversion to wanting to use the word oppression or even to acknowledge that in the Paralympic movement that it is discriminated against group of people that are being served. And we have to make sure that people have the correct lens and language and tools and resources to build up a community that has so many barriers to participating in sport. So I think that while it's so great to have a high performance sports system built, we need to have a better disability lens and intersectional lens because people have disabilities as well as, of course, take into account gender and ethnicity and gender expression and all of these different ways that make us unique and incredible individuals. But there are specific tools and resources that are necessary in order to allow people from minority groups to thrive. And so I think that was the biggest lesson for me is that we need more, this is sport across the board in sport, more athlete voices at the decision-making table, and diversity, equity, and inclusion needs to be, I would hope in the Paralympic movement, in the sport movement, that will be leaders, because in sport, in parasport, you will get all intersectionalities of humans. At the Paralympic Games, it is so interesting to see every single different intersectionality of human being, the most diverse celebration of humanity. And so I feel the Paralympic movement should be the leaders of diversity, equity, and inclusion and setting the example and the standards for other sectors and other domains of life on how to serve and create the environment for all people to thrive.
It's so inspiring. And if I could just take that a little bit further, and perhaps this is a bit of an unfair question because we could just spend the whole time on this very question, but what would that look like, Stephanie? Mm-hmm. What would, I know it's not quite fair, but we could start. What would need to happen to make our sports system truly inclusive? Like what would it look like? How would we know when we see it? And even if we just talk about, baby steps towards a really aspirational view, just to hear your thoughts about what that would look like.
Sure. Step one is, who said this to me? I'm not going to take credit for this. Someone said to me that I think it was Dr. Bruce Kidd, in order to make progress, you need to recognize where you're deficient. So I think step one is for us to recognize that we have room for improvement and the areas in which, if we look at the sports system, ideally it would be representative of our population. And so if we look at our sports system, who is it welcoming? Who is, I don't even say thriving, because that's a whole other metric there, but who's participating in sport? Who are our coaches? Who are our administrators? Is this representative of our population? Who's missing? And I think that it is common to think, okay, well, we just want to make sure that we're being inclusive to everybody. So everyone is welcome. But if you just open up the doors and say, everybody, you're welcome, some people are going to come and some people won't come. So for the communities of people that do not feel welcome for a number of different reasons to the sports system, in intentional amounts of money, resources, bridges need to be built. And so I think that it cannot be a passive approach to thinking, okay, well, we're not going to discriminate. That can't be the standard. We need to figure out how to build bridges and and it takes time. And this is something that I am absolutely guilty of, is thinking, well, we just need to do A, B, and C, and we'll fix all of the problems. But it's about relationship building, and relationship building takes time. And to figure out, I mean, I do not have the answers on how to, if you are doing a call out for a board of directors or for a CEO or for a coach, how do you attract a diverse and capable group of people? Because then capacity is also a very big issue. There is barriers to education for people with disability. So it's not that there are a whole bunch of people with disability who are trained as coaches or have the skill set of a CEO who are just being left out necessarily. We need to also create the pathways to make sure that there are groups of people with disability who have those skill sets. And so capacity building, and so it's a systemic, obviously there's a lot of layers here. And I think a big barrier is within an organization thinking, well, what's their responsibility? What is possible for that organization to do? But certainly welcoming in focus groups, it's tough, because I think we look to groups of people who are being left out and think, hey, can you tell us what the answer is? Can you please tell us how we can have more people like you in our organization? But it cannot be left up to the people who've been oppressed to come up with the solutions. It's certainly challenging. So I don't pretend to have any answers, but having these conversations is a great start. And I think there are more people becoming experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's becoming a whole field, a whole profession of accessibility inclusive consultants. So I think it's just drawing upon that and not stopping if you try one thing and it doesn't work. It will be a long process, but I think having diversity, equity, and inclusion and safety as a core value of organizations, and then every year you try and figure out what's happening and look to other organizations for best practices, and we can learn from each other. But I think we have to recognize that it's a problem, and then we'll go from there.
Mm-hmm. And if I could circle back to something you said earlier, when you were describing your experiences of an athlete, you mentioned that you didn't even know you had rights. And I'm sure there are many athletes who even currently would feel the same way. What are your thoughts on, how we can change that up to have a more rights-based approach that would not only lead to more inclusion, but more safety and so on?
Yes, I think, education is just such a big part of this. I mean, so in 2014, that I learned that, I was 30. I learned that I had rights as a person with a disability in this country, and as an athlete, as a woman, that there were certain things that I was inherently supposed to be afforded that I hadn't been. And so I think education, athletes, for them to know that they have rights is just so incredibly important, and to view sport as a partnership rather than a lot of athletes, we feel that we just have to produce. I owe my country, I owe my coach, I owe my parents, I owe this organization. All these people are investing in me and counting on me. I owe them a performance. And it's like, well, what's owed back to you? And whether you perform or not, having a positive, transformational, developmental experience, hopefully is owed to you by being a part of this sport system. And so I think that piece is missing, and we measure success in sport by performance, and that can be very dangerous. I know in my own career, I compromise my well-being for performance. Well, it's interesting to look at it that way, because I think I would have performed better if I had focused on my well-being. But at the time, I truly did believe that I had to shut away certain parts of my mental health and my well-being and my physical safety in order to be a high performance athlete and to perform. And I just had to be tougher and push through. And it was to my detriment. And I likely would have performed much better if I had taken a step back and addressed my mental health. But I didn't know that was something that was owed to me, or that I owed to myself.
Right. right. And your comment earlier about, how to integrate athletes' voices into the decisions that are made about them. And it makes me think about what we've learned about gender equity, that it's not about having one person on a committee to be responsible for communicating that voice, but to have a critical mass. And so, having athletes be at least half, you would like to say, of committees, right from bottom to top of the sport organization. You can imagine how more inclusive the sport environment may be and how more rights-based.
Well, it's interesting to think about, well, what are the barriers to people being, at the decision-making table? And I mean, sometimes it is the most obvious is just physical access. Well, we're meeting in this building that doesn't have an elevator, and right then and there, it's just like, this isn't accessible to you whatsoever. And then, when you're in the sports system as an athlete, what will make athletes want to give back and stay involved in the sports system? And if you feel that you've had your well-being prioritized and your development prioritized, I think we'll see a lot more athletes who want to stay in the sports system. But if you just feel, I think a lot of athletes feel that, well, as soon as I'm done, there's just someone else coming to take my place. I'm just a member of a team. I'm just a medal. I'm just a performance. And what is the word? It's like I'm disposable almost, because it's an assembly line. And when you feel that way, I don't think you necessarily want to come and join the committees or be a coach or a CEO or administrator. So I think an athlete's experience within the sport will be a very big indicator if they want to stay involved and give back. And for many para athletes, I think they do feel discrimination within the sport system. As chef, I would say the athletes coming to talk to me, it was way less about performance. Both Marnie, the chef at the Olympics, and myself wanted to make ourselves accessible to the athletes. We've been where you are, we've gone through these emotions. If you want to talk about your performance or the nerves or how to, manage those jitters, let us know. And I did have lots of athletes approach me, but ironically, very few of them wanted to talk about performance. They wanted to talk about the sport system and equity and discrimination that they had experienced, because I think we like to think that there's parasport that is inclusive and equitable over here, and then mainstream sport, and we're trying just to have the equity one entering the other. But within the Paralympic movement, there is issues with accessibility and inclusion. There's hierarchy for athletes and classifications, and many athletes who have higher support needs feel discriminated against, or within certain sports, depending on if you're more, if the para program is more integrated into the system or not. And so I think, yes, it would be so interesting to have an exit interview for all athletes. If we all, as we were retiring, could give exit interviews, because I think that while we only focus on the athletes who are in the system, I think it's only like once you've retired and you're looking back and you think, oh my goodness, and or wanting to have a voice. I think, because the athletes who came to me to chat about these types of things, they didn't want to address it with their coaches or their organization because fear of how they would be looked at or treated, or, and so just wanting to have an ear that's kind of separate from their performance pathway. Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm a little bit scrambled in that answer, but we will have more athletes giving back, I think, and staying involved if they have a more positive experience.
Yeah, no, it's great. You're touching on so many relevant and important points. And, there's been an effort to have a stronger partnership between the Olympics and Paralympics. And what was your experience of that in Tokyo?
It's such an interesting concept. people's questions about Olympics and Paralympics often come to, should it be one games? Should it be one big games? And in the past, I've always thought no, but I'm actually on the fence now. I'm not too sure where I stand. I think it'd be a really interesting conversation to look at it from all of the different angles. But integration, whether it's one big games or just the strong partnership with the Olympic Committee and the Paralympic Committee, there is danger. I mean, there is concern that if it's all under one umbrella, that the Olympics will get most of the attention and the say, and then the Paralympics is kind of just living in the shadow. So a couple examples of that from these games, in our clothing, for example, I as chef was not in any conversations about the clothing. I know that Marnie was a part of conversations about the clothing, and the pair of pants that we got, these good looking white pants that everybody saw in the opening and closing ceremonies, they were skinny jeans and very, very long. Mine, I think, were this much too long for me, and they were just very inaccessible. That's not very effective clothing for multiple different body types, is to have skinny white jeans. So just as an example.
Mhm.
So I think that as we get a closer partnership, it is so good for what it looks like and for public perception, and for having the Paralympic Games gain some more credibility that yes, it is high performance Olympic and Paralympic, same level of athleticism. But the concern is that we won't get a say. So in the gym, in our residence in Tokyo, we have a partnership with the Olympic Committee, so they leave a lot of their gym equipment behind, but a lot of it's not accessible. So we have athletes coming in and like, I can't use this stuff. So I think that it goes back to when you're like, I don't see disability, we're all the same. That's kind of great in the intention and the concept, but the reality is that it's actually creating additional barriers because we're not all the same, and we need to be given the correct tools and resources in order for us to be able to be included and thrive and have our performances be as supported and valued as the Olympics.
Right. Well, you've stimulated a lot of thinking. Many more questions I'd like to ask you, but maybe we'll give our audience a chance to pose questions. And I know Guylaine has been monitoring the chat. And
so we have some very, very great questions. I have one of my own. If you are planning to run in the next elections, you are so convincing and passionate. Okay, so the first question we got is someone is curious as to Stephanie's thoughts around school-based sport infrastructure for para-athletics. So does Stephanie believe that high schools and colleges should build and support para-athletics with school-based teams, or should there be a separate body for youth para-athletics?
Very, very good question. And, that gets me thinking just about the grassroots, because we're talking about the Paralympic Games, which is like this small little echelon up here of a small percentage of the greater population. So I think that for Paralympic sport to thrive in Canada, it has to be developed at all levels. And this is an argument like for the integration, is that absolutely, like whether it's preschools or parks, public parks, school programs, gym class, the amount of times that I was told I could sit out of my gym class at school as if that was a nice thing to do for this disabled person. It's incredibly, it's not only a barrier to my own development physically, but also just emotionally and how I view myself and my place in the world. So I think at all levels, but I do believe that the Paralympics and the Canadian Paralympic Committee, can set a tone and an example. And I know that they've provided resources for schools to be able to have inclusive activities and programs. It has to happen at all levels, and it really is a shift in our thinking. Sport mirrors society. Again, I did not come up with that. That's something that I've taken, I don't know from who, but sport mirrors society. And so today I was on the subway on the way to school, and I'm on crutches. I don't wear a prosthetic, you can't tell, but I'm on crutches with one leg, and I get on the subway, and there's signs everywhere that ask people, if you see someone with a disability, come on, please offer them your seat, which is great. And so I always come on, and it was quite full, so a couple of people offered me their seat. I'm happy to stand. I'm going to be sitting in class for hours. I'm very happy to stand. I'm very capable to stand, but I'm glad people asked. That's very nice to ask. And so I said, no, thank you, I'm fine. And so a couple minutes goes by, and a woman says, listen, will you please just take my seat so I'll stop feeling bad about myself? Like I'm feeling, and I just thought, is this about you? Or is this about me? Like, please take away my autonomy to make you feel better. And so I think it's, so to link this back to sport and the school system, it's just this massive shift on how we view people with disability, viewing them as capable humans, and bodies aren't disabling. Society and the attitudes and the lack of access is disabling. I saw a great TED talk from Stella Young. She was this incredible disability advocate from Australia who has since passed away, but describes the social model of disability. And she's like, my body does not disable me, you disable me. And I love it so much. So thinking that, it really is about not just changing sport programs, but it's just the way we think, the way we view difference. And so the word disability is probably quite problematic in trying to shift that view, because inherently it's a disability. It's like, it's right there in the word. So maybe we need to talk about, changing some of our language.
And just to follow up a bit, like, what was your experience in physical education classes? Like, because when we think about training our future teachers, I'm not sure that they are prepared.
I know. Yes, it's a great point. And I think there is a lot of pressure right now on teachers and coaches to think, okay, if we're going to shift and make sport or the classroom inclusive, accessible, it's a lot to unpack, and looking at it from an intersectional lens, it certainly is a lot to unpack. And so where do those resources come from? And I don't have the answer to that. And so for myself, going back to my parents, I had already participated in so many sports and activities when I got to gym class in school that I knew what I could and couldn't do. I knew that I was capable. So when I ran into teachers asking if I wanted to sit out, I'm so fortunate to my parents, or so grateful to my parents. And I was very fortunate to already have the confidence to say, no, I can do this. Like, I don't need to sit out. And I would modify what was happening in the class for myself. Once in a while, you get people who are very creative, and they're just like, oh, have you thought about this? Or have you thought about that? And I think it needs to be, when you go through teachers college or you're training to become a coach, instead of having, there's separate usual special education. I hate that word special. It's education for everybody. But there's usually like modules on special education. And for coaching, I know there's separate modules for adaptive or parasport. It needs to be integrated, because at the end of the day, like, my hope and goal would be that every teacher and coach, it's not up to them to figure out how to be accessible and inclusive and gender equitable. They've been trained that way, and they feel confident with those abilities. So when someone comes, we're very reactive. You have a disabled child who comes into your class, and you think, okay, I'm going to go on YouTube and I'm going to figure this out. And it shouldn't be an afterthought. I would hope that our teachers and coaches would be given those resources, and because that is a lot of pressure on them to have to figure it out for themselves.
And just so I would like to thank Jessica, because we just put in the chat the link to the TED Talk you were talking about, Stephanie. So it's there. So if people are curious, they want to. So that's thanks to Jessica. So another question is around safety. And the question is, what does equality look like for you? And in parasport, is parasport safe for athletes, and what needs to make it safe and welcoming? So it's a huge, big question, but really around safety.
So my initial reaction is no, parasport is not safe. And I'll start from a psychological standpoint, because, and this again mirrors society as well, but it happens in sport. The people who are serving para athletes, for the most part, I'd say 99% do not have a disability. And so you want, say there's an ableist comment that happens, or your needs are not being met, or you feel that you're being patronized or infantilized, because it happens very often with people with disability. And you want to help to educate the person, whether it's your coach or an administrator, and you say, hey, actually, like when you said that, it made me feel this way. It is very common that then the person is going to tell you about their good intentions and that they didn't mean it, or how bad they feel now. And then you're put in the position to make them feel better. And then you feel bad, you made them feel bad. And so you're just not going to bring it up anymore. So I would say that it does not feel psychologically safe when you're being served by people that do not understand what you've gone through. And at the end of the day, I mean, this might be a very broad generalization, but people with disability have been, I believe, traumatized because of the way society treats us. And I might have some people, certainly when I was younger, I would have fought that comment. So I understand anyone out there with a disability might disagree with me. But my lens now is just the way that I believe that all women have experienced sexism and misogyny in their lives. It's built into our culture and our society. And so, no, I don't think that it is necessarily safe. The world for people with disability, is it safe? I don't know. But I think that it's very exciting that we're having conversations about how can we make it safe. Because the same safety concerns exist for people with disability that exist for people without disability. And then you also add the disability lens on top of that. So I think, the research is showing us that athletes with disability are at a higher risk for maltreatment, especially if you're a female with a disability in a high performance sports situation, you are at high risk for maltreatment. And so I think in general, the safety can be improved, but I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation, to be doing research and to be helping to empower athletes to know what their rights are, hopefully at some point, and for us to make things safer.
So maybe we have time for one more question, and then Gretchen, you can have the concluding remarks. And it's just a link. So I saw the question and the example you just gave, and sometimes we feel like we would love to be great ally, and sometimes we're struggling between we wanted to do something, and then we sometimes feel like an imposter because we cannot talk on behalf of. So how do we manage that? Like, what any advice to help us become great ally to para sport in general and para athletes, para coaches?
It's a great question, Gila. Thank you for that. And I also just want to be clear as well, as that as I answer this question, I'm asking the same question of myself for the groups that I like, the demographics that I don't belong to, for how I can be an ally as well. And it's just such an interesting time in our society where we are, lots of people, it's very encouraging. Lots of people are starting to recognize how they might contribute to the harm of other groups of people, or are compliant with systems that are harmful to other groups of people. So I just want to be clear, I'm doing my own work as well. I think we can all do work because it's it's impossible to see the world through the lens of a demographic that you're not a part of. So I think reading books is important, because it's going back to, it is not the people who've been oppressed. It's not our responsibility to come up with the solutions. And I mean, it's like, yes, first we're going to traumatize people, and then we're also going to expect you to figure out the answers and this and that. And I'm not talking about myself right now. I'm putting myself in a position where I do want to chat and have those conversations. But I think a lot of times people think, oh, I have a friend with a disability or who's of a different ethnicity. I can talk to them and they can figure out with me how I can be better. And I think that's a pretty heavy burden for minority groups to have to bear. So I think reading books, and I've been reading a lot of books on anti-racism from lots of different lenses myself. And I love, Guylaine, that you said not to speak or advocate on behalf of other people. How do we raise the platform? And I think in sport, this goes back to a lot of the organizations or the advocacy for athletes with disability are being spoken by people who don't have disability. And so I think we just need, going back to Gretchen had mentioned this, like where is the athlete voice in all of this? And how do we raise up the people around us whose voices need to be heard. And also when people bring up to us something that we might have done or said that they found harmful or hurtful or discriminatory, for us just to say, thank you for bringing that to my attention. You don't need to inundate them with your excuses and again, I not to be self-righteous, I'm working on this as well. I'm trying, it's natural for humans to get defensive. I think like, oh, I'm a good person, I didn't mean it. And it's like, yes, we're all good people who have biased and racist and ableist views, and we can all do better. So I think just coming at our positions from, how can I educate myself and how can I accept feedback in the most gracious way possible.
Well, I wish we had another couple of hours with you, Stephanie. We'll have to have you back and have a follow-up session. On behalf of eAlliance and everybody here, thank you so much for not only spending this time with us, but being so candid in terms of your own experiences, your perspectives, your recommendations, and so on. Really so informative in terms of where we need to go with further research and improved practices. There's a long research agenda coming out of your talk today. And while, there's certainly been points of today's session that have been shocking, distressing, discouraging, and so on, somehow you've managed to leave us with confidence in future aspirations. And I think it's your passion that's contagious and leads us to believe that, what, we can do better. And so thank you so much again for contributing to this session today. We're so grateful.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm just so passionate, as you can tell, but I love having these conversations. And yeah, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Good. All right. And everybody stay tuned for our next topic, which will be running in the new year, our next Equity Matters webinar. So please stay tuned. And thanks again so much, everyone, for joining us today.